Amina had always considered her marriage to Joseph a blessing. He was a respected man in the community, known for his wit and charm. Amina, with her soft-spoken nature and tireless devotion to her family, complemented him perfectly. For years, she believed they had built a life rooted in love and mutual respect. That belief shattered one fateful evening. Joseph returned home late, as he often did in recent weeks. Amina sat by the flickering lantern, her fingers working rhythmically over her knitting. The tension in the air was palpable even before he uttered a word. "Hi besties, welcome to Folktales by Aijay. Thank you for your love and support to this family. Please like, share, leave a comment and subscribe to this channel." "I need to tell you something," Joseph said to Amina, his tone unusually firm. Amina set her work aside, her heart quickening. "What is it, Joseph?" "There's someone else I care about." The words struck her like a blow. For a moment, she thought she misheard. The room seemed to tilt as she stared at her husband, searching his face for a sign that this was some cruel joke. But his expression was cold, unyielding. "What do you mean, someone else?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Her name is Anita," Joseph continued, avoiding her eyes. "She's coming to stay here." The room fell silent except for the distant croaking of frogs outside. Amina blinked, trying to process his words. "Stay here? In our home?" "Yes," he said matter-of-factly. "You'll make room for her. She's important to me, and I won't have any arguments." The finality in his tone left no room for negotiation. Amina felt her throat tighten, but she refused to let the tears fall. "Not yet." "And what about me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "You'll adapt," he replied coldly. "It's what women do." The days that followed were a blur of humiliation and heartbreak. Joseph wasted no time bringing Anita into their home. She was a striking woman, her beauty sharp and commanding. Amina felt invisible in her presence, reduced to a shadow in her own house. "Move those things," Anita ordered the first morning, pointing to the carefully arranged flowers Amina had placed on the dining table. "They're in the way." Amina complied silently, her hands trembling. It was the first of many such commands. Soon, Anita treated her not as the wife of the house, but as a servant. She demanded meals, rearranged furniture, and spoke down to Amina with a condescending tone that stung like salt on an open wound. Joseph, once her confidant and partner, turned a blind eye to everything. He acted as though Anita's presence was perfectly normal, as if Amina's pain was an inconvenience he preferred to ignore. One evening, as Amina scrubbed the kitchen floor, Anita sauntered in, her high heels clicking against the tiles. "You missed a spot," she said with a smirk, pointing to a corner. Amina paused, her hand tightening around the rag. She wanted to scream, to demand respect, to remind this woman, and Joseph, that this was her home. But she swallowed her pride, biting back the words that burned in her throat. That night, as she lay on the bed as Joseph had relegated her to in the guest room, Amina stared at the ceiling. The walls seemed to close in on her, suffocating her spirit. She clutched her chest, where her heart ached as if it had been shattered into pieces too small to mend. But somewhere in the darkness, a flicker of resolve sparked within her. Amina wasn't just a woman to be discarded, a servant to be ordered around. She was a fighter. Her mother had taught her strength, her father had instilled resilience, and her faith whispered that this storm, no matter how fierce, would not last forever. As tears silently streamed down her face, Amina made a vow. She would endure, for now. But she would not break. The next morning, Amina rose early, as was her habit. The rooster's crow signaled the start of a new day, but instead of feeling the familiar comfort of routine, her stomach churned with dread. Anita's presence had already begun to reshape the dynamics of the household. When Amina entered the kitchen, Anita was there, sipping tea as if she owned the space. "Oh, you're finally awake," Anita drawled, glancing at her over the rim of the cup. "I was wondering when breakfast would be ready." Amina nodded, biting her tongue. She had always believed in humility and patience, but this was a test she wasn't sure she could pass. As she prepared the morning meal, Anita's voice filled the kitchen, sharp and commanding. "Joseph likes his eggs scrambled, not boiled. I hope you know that." "I know what my husband likes," Amina replied quietly, though her hands shook as she cracked the eggs into the pan. Anita chuckled, a cold sound that sent chills down Amina's spine. "Good. Then make sure you don't forget." When breakfast was served, Joseph sat at the head of the table, as he always did, but something about him felt different. He no longer met Amina's gaze. It was as if he had decided she no longer mattered. Anita sat beside him, chatting animatedly about a topic Amina didn't care to follow. As she served the food, Anita frowned. "The tea is too cold," she said, pushing the cup toward Amina. "Fix it." Joseph didn't intervene. He didn't even flinch. Amina's chest tightened as she took the cup and returned to the kitchen, her face burning with humiliation. Later that day, as Anita lounged on the living room sofa, she called out to Amina. "Fetch me some water." Amina hesitated, standing in the doorway with her hands clenched at her sides. She wanted to say no, to tell this woman she wasn't a servant. But Joseph walked in at that moment, his expression stern. "Anita asked for water," he said, his tone a warning. Amina nodded and turned toward the kitchen. Her feet felt like lead, each step heavier than the last. When she returned with the glass, Anita smirked. "Thank you," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. That evening, as Amina sat alone in the guest room, she let herself cry for the first time since Anita's arrival. The walls seemed to echo with her pain, a silent reminder of how drastically her life had changed. But amid her tears, a memory surfaced, a conversation with her late mother. "Amina," her mother had said, "life will test you in ways you cannot imagine. But remember, even the strongest storm cannot last forever. Be patient, but never forget your worth." Those words became a lifeline. Amina wiped her tears and took a deep breath. She would not let Anita or Joseph destroy her spirit. Over the following days, Amina observed the household dynamics with quiet determination. She noticed how Anita's charm seemed to falter in small ways when she thought no one was watching. A sharp tone with Joseph here, a dismissive gesture there. Joseph didn't seem to notice, but Amina did. Her resolve grew stronger with each passing day. She knew she couldn't confront them outright, yet. But she began to make small, subtle changes. She rearranged the kitchen cabinets so Anita couldn't find what she needed. She cleaned with exaggerated care, ensuring that Anita's favorite chair was always slightly damp when she sat down. It wasn't much, but it gave Amina a sliver of control in a situation that felt overwhelmingly oppressive. One afternoon, as she swept the front porch, a neighbor stopped by. It was Mama Grace, an older woman known for her wisdom and sharp tongue. "Amina," she said, her voice low, "people are talking about what's happening in your house." Amina stiffened. "What are they saying?" "That your husband has lost his senses," Mama Grace replied bluntly. "But don't worry, my dear. The truth always comes out, one way or another." Amina nodded, her heart heavy but hopeful. She didn't know how or when, but she was certain of one thing: this storm would not break her. Amina began her day with a calmness that surprised even herself. The chaos in her home had become routine, but deep inside, something was stirring, a quiet defiance she hadn't felt before. As she cleaned the living room, Anita's shrill voice interrupted her thoughts. "Amina, this rug hasn't been cleaned properly. Are you even paying attention?" Amina paused, her hands gripping the edge of the broom. "I'll clean it again," she said softly, her tone neutral. She had learned to mask her emotions, to keep her anger buried deep where no one could see. Anita smirked, lounging on the couch as though she owned the house. "Good. I expect nothing less." Joseph walked in moments later, carrying a newspaper. He glanced briefly at Amina before turning his attention to Anita. "What's all the noise about?" "Your wife needs to learn how to clean properly," Anita replied with a laugh, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Joseph chuckled, a sound that pierced Amina's heart. Once, his laughter had been a source of comfort. Now, it was a dagger, a reminder of how far he had strayed from the man she had married. But Amina remained silent. She knew better than to argue. Instead, she focused on her task, sweeping every corner of the room with meticulous care. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she overheard snippets of Joseph and Anita's conversation in the living room. They spoke in hushed tones, their words laced with secrecy. "She'll break eventually," Anita said with a sneer. "She knows her place," Joseph replied dismissively. Amina's hands trembled as she chopped vegetables, but she forced herself to remain calm. Their cruelty only fueled her determination. She would not break. After dinner, while Anita and Joseph lounged in the bedroom, Amina slipped outside to the backyard. The cool night air wrapped around her like a comforting embrace. She sank onto the wooden bench her father had built years ago, staring up at the stars. Memories of her childhood flooded her mind, her mother's gentle laughter, her father's strong yet kind demeanor. They had taught her the value of resilience, of standing tall even when the world seemed determined to knock her down. As she sat there, a faint sound caught her attention. She turned to see Mama Grace standing by the fence, her wrinkled face illuminated by the moonlight. "Good evening, Mama Grace," Amina said, rising to her feet. Mama Grace waved her back down. "Sit, my dear. I just came to check on you." Amina hesitated before sitting again. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice wavered. Mama Grace's eyes softened. "I know it's hard, Amina. But you are stronger than you realize. Don't let them break your spirit." Amina nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Thank you, Mama Grace." As the older woman disappeared into the darkness, Amina felt a surge of determination. She wasn't alone. There were people who saw her, who believed in her. The next day, Amina decided to reclaim small pieces of herself. She wore the bright yellow scarf her mother had given her, a symbol of hope and resilience. When Anita sneered at it, Amina smiled politely but didn't remove it. She also began humming softly as she worked, a habit she had abandoned since Anita's arrival. The melody was a lullaby her mother used to sing, a reminder of the strength that ran through her veins. Anita, clearly irritated, snapped at her more frequently. "Must you make that noise all the time?" But Amina didn't stop. She let the song flow from her lips, each note a quiet act of rebellion. Joseph noticed the change too. One evening, as Amina served dinner, he frowned. "You seem different." Amina met his gaze for the first time in weeks. "I'm the same, Joseph," she said simply. "Perhaps you're the one who's changed." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. For a moment, Joseph looked as though he might respond, but Anita interrupted, pulling his attention back to her. Amina returned to the kitchen, her heart pounding. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As she lay on her mat that night, Amina whispered a prayer. "Give me strength, Lord. Help me endure this storm and come out stronger." She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, she would not let Joseph and Anita define her. She was more than their servant, more than their victim. She was Amina, a silent warrior. Amina moved through the market, her woven basket balanced carefully on her arm. She greeted familiar faces with a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her burdens felt heavier with each passing day, but she had no intention of letting the world see her pain. "Amina, is that you?" a voice called from behind. She turned to see Mama Grace approaching, her pace brisk, despite her age. The older woman's eyes scanned Amina's face, her expression softening with concern. "Yes, Mama Grace," Amina replied, forcing her lips into a smile. I'm here for the usual: tomatoes, yams, and spices. Mama Grace stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Child, the whole village knows what's happening in your home. Why haven't you spoken out? Amina glanced around nervously. The market was bustling with activity, but she felt as though every pair of eyes was on her. It's not that simple, she said quietly. He's still my husband. Mama Grace placed a hand on Amina's shoulder. That man has no respect for you, bringing another woman into your home like that. And her? Treating you as if you're beneath her? Amina's throat tightened, but she nodded. I can't change what they've done, Mama Grace. I can only endure. The older woman's face softened further. You're stronger than you think, Amina. But remember, even the strongest need help sometimes. Before Amina could respond, Mama Grace pressed a small wrapped package into her hand. Take this, she said. It's just some herbs for strength. Brew it into tea when you feel overwhelmed. And if you ever need someone to talk to, my door is always open. Amina thanked her, the warmth of Mama Grace's kindness easing the weight on her shoulders. As she walked home, the chatter of the market faded into the background. The package in her hand felt like a lifeline, a reminder that she wasn't completely alone in her struggles. Back at the house, Anita was lounging in the living room, painting her nails. She looked up as Amina entered. You're late, she snapped. What took you so long? I was delayed at the market, Amina replied evenly, setting the basket on the kitchen counter. Anita rolled her eyes. Well, hurry up with dinner. Joseph will be home soon, and he doesn't like to wait. Amina bit back a retort, focusing instead on preparing the evening meal. She moved with quiet efficiency, her mind replaying Mama Grace's words. Later that night, as she sipped the herbal tea Mama Grace had given her, Amina felt a strange sense of calm. The bitterness of the brew seemed to melt her exhaustion, leaving her with a renewed sense of clarity. The days that followed brought more whispers of support. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now found subtle ways to encourage her. Mom Nkechi, the seamstress, offered to mend Amina's worn clothes free of charge. A strong woman deserves to look her best, she said with a wink. Even the children in the village seemed to sense Amina's pain. One afternoon, a small boy ran up to her with a wildflower he had picked. For you, Auntie Amina, he said, grinning shyly before darting away. These small acts of kindness became Amina's anchors. Though her days were still filled with Anita's sharp commands and Joseph's indifference, she began to feel a flicker of hope. One evening, as she swept the front yard, Mama Grace appeared again, her hands clasped behind her back. Amina, she said, her voice gentle but firm. You can't let them treat you this way forever. There will come a time when you must stand up for yourself. I'm afraid, Mama Grace, Amina admitted. What if I fail? What if it only makes things worse? Mama Grace nodded, her expression thoughtful. Fear is natural, child. But courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. When the moment comes, you'll know what to do. That night, as Amina lay on her mat, Mama Grace's words echoed in her mind. She didn't feel courageous, but she knew she couldn't continue living as she was. For now, she would endure. But deep in her heart, a spark of resistance had been lit. And she knew it was only a matter of time before it grew into a flame. The days that followed were an endless cycle of chores and silent suffering. Amina woke early each morning to prepare breakfast, cleaned the house, and made dinner, all while silently enduring Anita's demands. Joseph, as always, offered no support. He seemed content to live in his illusion of bliss with Anita, completely ignoring the cracks in his marriage. But the cracks were there, widening with every passing day. Amina could feel it. She no longer recognized the man she had married. She no longer recognized herself. One afternoon, as Amina prepared lunch, Anita entered the kitchen, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. I'm tired of waiting for you to serve me, Anita declared, sitting down at the kitchen table. Why don't you ever get things right? Amina bit her lip, holding back the words that wanted to pour out. Instead, she focused on chopping vegetables, her movements deliberate. I said, why don't you ever get things right? Anita repeated, her voice rising. Amina felt her heart race. She turned to face the woman who had taken her place in her home, in her life. I am doing my best, Anita, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Anita sneered. Your best? Please. The only thing you're good at is being a servant. Amina's pulse quickened, and for the first time in weeks, the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface erupted. Stop calling me that, she shouted, her hands shaking. I am not your servant. I am his wife. The room fell silent. Amina stood there, breathless, her chest heaving with the force of her outburst. Anita stared at her, wide-eyed, as if she couldn't quite believe what she had heard. Joseph entered the kitchen just then, his gaze flicking between the two women. His eyes narrowed as he took in the tension in the air. What's going on here? He asked, his voice low. Amina's heart pounded in her chest as she met his gaze. This was the moment. The moment she had been dreading and hoping for. You tell me, Joseph, Amina said, her voice trembling but resolute. Is this what you want? To have her in our home, treating me like I don't exist? Is this what you've chosen? Joseph's face darkened. Amina, I don't have time for this. You know how things are. Just accept it. Accept it? Amina repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. You want me to accept being invisible in my own home? To accept this humiliation? Amina stood up, her expression icy. You've made your choice, Joseph. You've chosen her over me. Don't forget that. Joseph turned on her, his voice sharp. Don't start, Amina. This is not the time. Amina's heart shattered as she watched him defend Anita with such fervor, but it was the final straw. She had reached her breaking point. You're right, Joseph. This isn't the time, Amina said, her voice colder than she intended. But it will be soon. And when it is, I will be ready. With that, she walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind a stunned silence. Outside, the air was thick with tension as Amina stood in the yard, her mind racing. She didn't know what to do next, but she knew she couldn't keep living like this. Her marriage, her life, it had all been built on lies, on compromise, on pain. But something inside her had shifted. For the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of power. She didn't have to accept this. She didn't have to let Joseph or Anita control her. That night, after dinner, Amina retreated to the guest room, where she had spent many hours in solitude. There, with the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls, she allowed herself to think. She had always been a patient woman, quiet and humble, but the time for patience had passed. It was time for her to stand up, not just for herself, but for the future she wanted. A future where she was more than just a servant, more than just a wife. She didn't know exactly what the next step would be, but she felt the first stirrings of a plan. A plan that would take time to unfold, but one that would ultimately free her from this nightmare. Amina closed her eyes, a feeling of resolve sweeping over her. She would no longer be a passive bystander in her own life. She was going to take back control. Amina woke before dawn, the soft light of the early morning peeking through the cracks in the wooden shutters. The house was still, but inside, her heart beat loudly, her thoughts racing. It had been 2 days since her confrontation with Joseph and Anita, and though the tension in the house had not lessened, something had changed inside her. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a quiet determination to take back what had been stolen from her. She rose from her mat and began her morning routine, but this time, it was different. She moved with purpose, every step deliberate. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread as she prepared breakfast. But her mind was focused on a plan, a way to regain her independence without making another scene. Anita entered the kitchen just as Amina was placing the last of the bread on the table. "Still making breakfast, I see," she remarked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Amina didn't respond immediately. She set the bread down carefully, then turned to face Anita. "I'm not your servant, Anita. I'm doing this for my husband. Not for you." Anita scoffed. "Your husband? He's mine now, Amina. He doesn't even look at you anymore. You're just a shadow of the woman you used to be." The words stung, but Amina held her ground. She had heard them all before, but today, they no longer had the power to break her. She knew what she had to do. Later that morning, Amina slipped out of the house to visit Mama Grace. The older woman had been a source of strength for her, and Amina needed her guidance more than ever. When she arrived, Mama Grace was tending to her garden, the scent of blooming flowers filling the air. She looked up as Amina approached, her face lighting up with a smile. "Ah, Amina. You're up early today. What brings you to my humble garden?" Amina smiled, but it was a bittersweet smile. "I need your advice, Mama Grace. I don't know how much longer I can stay in that house, being treated like I'm invisible." Mama Grace patted the seat next to her. "Sit, child. We will talk." Amina sat down, the coolness of the morning air soothing her troubled heart. "I don't know what to do anymore," Amina confessed. "I've tried to be patient. I've tried to endure, but every day it gets harder. Joseph, he's changed. He's not the man I married. And Anita, she treats me like I'm nothing." Mama Grace listened silently, nodding occasionally as Amina spoke. When she finished, the older woman let out a sigh. "My dear, I can see the pain in your eyes, but I also see something else, strength. You may not realize it, but you are stronger than you think. You have the power to change your situation. But first, you must believe in yourself." Amina shook her head. "I'm not sure I can change anything. I don't have the resources, the strength, not like Anita does." Mama Grace smiled knowingly. "Anita may have her charms, but you have something far more valuable. You have dignity. You have a heart that is strong and capable. You just need to trust in it." Amina felt a glimmer of hope as Mama Grace's words settled in her mind. "But how? How do I take the first step?" Mama Grace's eyes sparkled with wisdom. "You don't need to make a grand gesture. Start small. Find a way to assert yourself, to take back your power in little ways. Don't let them see you as weak." Amina nodded slowly, taking in Mama Grace's advice. She had always been afraid to speak up, to assert her own needs, but now she understood that her silence was costing her more than her dignity, it was costing her peace. The next few days were a blur of small but significant changes. Amina began to speak up more, setting boundaries that Joseph and Anita both found uncomfortable. When Anita complained about the food, Amina replied firmly, "I've cooked what I could. You are free to eat or not." When Joseph tried to brush off his behavior, Amina stood her ground. "I'm not invisible, Joseph. I am your wife, and I deserve respect." It wasn't easy. There were moments when she wanted to retreat into silence, moments when she feared the consequences of her actions. But each time she spoke, each time she asserted herself, she felt a bit stronger. One evening, after a long day of asserting her boundaries, Amina sat in the living room, her eyes tired but her spirit unbroken. Joseph and Anita were in the bedroom, laughing, as they always did. For a moment, Amina felt the familiar pang of loneliness, but she quickly shook it off. She wasn't alone. She had herself. And she was enough. As she lay in bed that night, Amina felt a sense of peace wash over her. The storm wasn't over, but she had taken the first step. She had begun the quiet revolution that would change everything. days turned into weeks, and Amina's quiet revolution continued, though not without consequences. Joseph had noticed the change in her. He no longer dismissed her as easily, and Anita's sharp tongue was less frequent in the house. But there was an undercurrent of tension, something unspoken, lingering in the air. Amina knew things were building up to something. It was only a matter of time before the storm broke. One evening, after dinner, Joseph sat on the porch with a drink in hand, staring into the distance. Amina's eyes flickered toward him as she cleared the table, but she didn't say anything. She had learned to give him space, to wait for him to come to her. But tonight, she felt a strange pull, a nagging sense that something was wrong. Anita came out shortly after, her heels clicking sharply on the stone floor. She eyed Amina, who was wiping down the dishes, and then turned her attention to Joseph, sitting just a few feet away. There was something in her eyes, a glint of something darker than usual. "You've been quiet, Joseph," Anita said, her voice laced with a certain edge. "Too quiet. Are you going to let her change everything?" Joseph didn't look at her right away, but the tension in his posture told Amina all she needed to know. There was more to this situation than just the superficial disagreements between them. Amina's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral as she finished cleaning up. She knew she had no choice but to face whatever was coming. She had pushed Joseph to the edge, and now she would have to deal with the fallout. "Leave her alone, Anita," Joseph finally said, his voice sharp. "She's not the problem. You are." Amina's breath caught in her chest. The words were like a slap, a betrayal. For a moment, she stood frozen, unsure of what to do with this new revelation. Anita's laugh was harsh, mocking. "Oh, Joseph. You think she's going to save you? You think she's the answer?" Joseph stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough," he snapped. "I'm not doing this anymore." He turned toward Amina, his eyes filled with something she couldn't read. "I don't love you anymore, Amina." The words felt like a punch to her gut. She could hear Anita's soft snicker in the background, but she couldn't bring herself to turn and face her. She didn't want to hear it. She didn't want to believe it. But as Joseph's words sank in, something inside her clicked, a cold realization that he had already made his choice. Amina turned away, her hands trembling as she gathered her thoughts. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears were too far away, buried deep inside her. She left the porch and walked to the guest room, the familiar silence of the small room swallowing her up. She leaned against the wall, her mind racing. Amina had suspected for a long time that Joseph's heart had wandered, that his attention had shifted. But hearing him say it out loud, the brutal finality of his words, was something she hadn't been prepared for. She had hoped there was still a chance, still a way to make things right, but now it felt like the door had been slammed shut. As she stood there in the quiet darkness, a strange calm washed over her. She realized that she had spent so long trying to hold on to a man who had already let go of her. The only person she could depend on was herself. And it was time for her to stop playing this dangerous game of waiting and hoping. The decision was made. She had to leave. But even as Amina resolved to take control of her life, she knew it would not be an easy journey. There would be obstacles. There would be challenges. There would be pain. But for the first time in years, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. The following days were tense, and Amina's every movement was calculated. She no longer wasted time on small talk with Joseph or Anita. She had grown used to their cold indifference and their underhanded comments. But in the silence of their home, Amina's mind was racing, formulating a plan that would free her from the chains she had bound herself to for so long. She couldn't just leave without a plan. She had no family to run to, and starting over in a strange city was a daunting prospect. Yet, the thought of staying and enduring the daily humiliation felt even more unbearable. One evening, after finishing the dishes, Amina quietly left the house under the guise of getting some fresh air. She walked through the back garden and past the neighbor's house until she reached Mama Grace's humble home at the edge of the village. The old woman greeted her with a knowing look, as if she had been expecting her. "Amina," Mama Grace said warmly, "you're here earlier than usual." Amina sat down beside her, her eyes weary. "I need your help, Mama Grace. I've made up my mind. I have to leave him, but I don't know where to go or how to begin." Mama Grace studied her carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "You've been living in a storm, child, but sometimes we have to weather the storm alone to find our way. What are you planning?" Amina took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "I've saved a little money over the years. I can't take much, but I have enough to make a start. I just need a place to go. Somewhere I can begin again. Somewhere I can find peace." Mama Grace nodded slowly. "Starting over is never easy, but it's always possible. There is a small town a few days away, not far from here. It's quiet, peaceful. You can find work there and start fresh." Amina felt a wave of relief wash over her. A place to go. A chance to start over. She had never thought it possible, but now it seemed like a beacon of hope. "What about Joseph?" Mama Grace asked, her voice soft. "How will you leave him?" Amina winced at the thought of confronting Joseph. She had been avoiding him, giving him space to stew in his decisions. But now, the time had come to face him, to make it clear that she was leaving, not for revenge, but for her own survival. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been trying to avoid him, but I can't keep running forever. I have to tell him the truth, even if it hurts." Mama Grace reached out and placed a hand on Amina's. "Whatever happens, you have the strength to get through it. You must remember that. You are not defined by what he has done or what he will do. You are defined by your choices, and your choice is to move forward." Amina nodded, tears threatening to fall, but she held them back. She wasn't weak. She wasn't a victim. And she was no longer willing to allow Joseph's betrayal to control her life. As she prepared to leave Mama Grace's house that evening, the weight of her decisions settled in. She had a plan now. She had a future. That night, after Joseph and Anita had gone to bed, Amina gathered her things. She packed only the essentials, clothes, a few cherished keepsakes, and the money she had saved. She moved quietly through the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to make a scene. She didn't want to face the hurt in Joseph's eyes, or the anger in Anita's. She only wanted to leave, to escape the prison that had been her life for so long. With her bag slung over her shoulder, Amina walked to the door. She took one last look at the house that had once been her home, now feeling like a stranger's house. She would never return. As she stepped outside, the cool night air greeted her like an old friend. For the first time in years, Amina felt free. The weight on her shoulders was gone. She was taking control of her life. She was going to create her own future, far away from the pain of the past. With each step she took, she left behind a life that had once been hers and moved toward the unknown. Amina walked under the darkened sky, her footsteps light yet resolute. The moon hung high above, a lone witness to her quiet departure. The village that had once felt so familiar now seemed distant, its sounds muffled by the weight of her decision. She didn't look back, she knew that every step forward was a step away from the life she had known, one filled with betrayal, pain, and silence. The road to Mama Grace's recommended town was long, winding, and uncertain. The village where she had lived her whole life seemed so far away now, as if the distance between them had grown with each mile she walked. Amina didn't know exactly what awaited her in the town, but she was determined to find out. By the time dawn began to break, Amina was exhausted, her legs aching from the long walk. She hadn't expected to feel so alone, but the reality of her escape hit her hard as the sun rose on her new, unknown future. She paused by the side of the road, looking around at the vast emptiness. There was no turning back now. A soft rustling caught her attention. She turned to see a small group of women approaching on the same road, their baskets balanced expertly on their heads. They were laughing, their voices carrying across the still morning air. Amina watched them for a moment, their carefree energy a stark contrast to the turmoil she had left behind. One of the women noticed Amina standing alone and approached her. She was older, her face lined with the wisdom of many years, but her eyes were kind. "You look like you've walked a long way, my sister. Are you in need of company?" Amina smiled faintly, grateful for the woman's kindness. "I've walked all night," she replied. "I'm trying to get to a town." "A small town. I don't know the way." The woman nodded, her smile deepening. "You're heading to Wuya, aren't you? It's a little further down the road. You'll pass a river, and after that, you'll see the town. Don't worry, you're almost there." Amina's heart lifted. She was close. The prospect of a new life, even if uncertain, was within reach. She had made the right decision, and now, with the help of this stranger, she felt even more certain. "Thank you," Amina said, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." The woman looked at her kindly. "We all have our struggles, child. But the road ahead is long, and you must keep walking." With that, the group of women continued on their way, and Amina resumed her journey, the weight on her shoulders feeling lighter. She was no longer looking over her shoulder at what she had left behind. She was focusing on the horizon, on what lay ahead. Hours passed, and by midday, Amina found herself standing before the wide, flowing river that the woman had spoken of. She stared at the water for a long moment, the river's steady current a reminder of the flow of time and how she, too, had moved on from her old life. The town of Wuya soon came into view, a cluster of simple houses nestled between rolling hills. It was a peaceful place, with little hustle and bustle. Amina felt an overwhelming sense of relief as she stepped into the town, the silence around her a balm to her bruised soul. This was the place where she could start again. She walked to the town square, searching for someone who could offer her a place to stay or some work to do. A few people looked her way as she passed, but most were busy with their own lives. It was a quiet place, and it made Amina feel small, but in a way that comforted her. Eventually, she found a small inn where she could rent a room for the night. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with graying hair, was kind and welcoming. She offered Amina a warm meal, and Amina accepted with gratitude. As she sat at the small table, eating the warm food, Amina realized just how far she had come. She had crossed a river, walked through an unfamiliar town, and left behind a life that had drained her. But now, in the quiet of the inn, she felt a strange peace settling over her. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers to walk. Amina knew the journey wasn't over. There would be challenges, yes, and moments of doubt, but she had already proven to herself that she was capable of facing them. She had made it this far, and she would continue to make her way forward. For the first time in years, Amina allowed herself to smile. She was free. She was alive. And no matter what, she would build a future that was hers. The following weeks in Wuya were both a challenge and a blessing for Amina. The town, though small and quiet, had a rhythm to it that she quickly adapted to. She found work at a local shop, helping the owner, an elderly woman named Mama Ada, with various tasks. Mama Ada had a gentle spirit, and she welcomed Amina like a daughter. The work was simple, but it was honest. Every day, Amina learned new things, from counting coins to arranging goods, and slowly, she started to feel a sense of belonging. The transition wasn't easy. There were moments when Amina would sit in the corner of her small room, staring at the bare walls, overwhelmed by the memories of the life she had left behind. She missed the familiar comfort of her home, even though it had been filled with pain. But she reminded herself every single day that she had made the right choice. She had chosen herself, chosen freedom, and she wasn't going to let fear or loneliness stop her from moving forward. One afternoon, while working at the shop, Amina overheard a conversation between two women who came in to buy some goods. They were speaking excitedly about a community meeting that was going to take place the following evening at the town hall. It was about a new project aimed at empowering women and helping them start small businesses. The idea of a fresh start, a chance to take control of her future, sparked something in Amina. She had always dreamed of starting her own business, of doing something that would make her proud. Perhaps this was the opportunity she had been waiting for. The next day, after finishing her shift at the shop, Amina made her way to the town hall. As she entered, she was greeted by a group of women, all busy discussing the details of the project. They were all eager to share their ideas and experiences. Amina's heart raced with excitement. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of possibility. She wasn't just a victim of her circumstances. She was a woman with dreams, and now, there were people who believed in those dreams. Amina joined the group, and before long, she was participating in the discussions, offering her thoughts on how the project could grow and thrive. The women were welcoming, and they embraced her ideas, encouraging her to pursue her own vision. They talked about starting small, perhaps a market stall, where Amina could sell homemade goods or produce. They spoke of how important it was for women to support one another, to create something lasting for themselves. By the end of the meeting, Amina felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore, she was planning for her future, for a life that was entirely hers to shape. As the weeks passed, Amina worked tirelessly on her new venture. She started small, with a table at the local market selling handmade soaps and lotions, which she had learned to make from a local herbalist. Her products were simple, but they were made with love and care. Slowly, people began to notice. Customers returned, spreading the word about the new vendor at the market, and before long, Amina's stall was one of the busiest in the town. Each sale was a small victory, a reminder of how far she had come. With every success, Amina grew more confident in her abilities. She wasn't just the woman who had walked away from an abusive marriage, she was a businesswoman, a creator, a survivor. One evening, as Amina sat in her small room, counting the money she had earned that day, she realized that she had finally begun to heal. She had taken control of her life and built something meaningful. Her journey had been long and painful, but it had led her here, to a place where she could be proud of the woman she had become. As the sun set over Wuya, casting a warm golden glow over the town, Amina looked out the window, her heart full of gratitude. The road ahead was still uncertain, but she had learned that with determination, courage, and the support of those around her, she could overcome anything. Amina had walked away from a life of pain, but in doing so, she had found her true strength. And now, with the future spread out before her like an open field, she knew one thing for sure: no matter what came next, she would face it with the same resilience, the same courage that had brought her this far. Her new life had just begun. Thank you, besties, for watching. Did you enjoy our story? Please leave a comment, like, share and subscribe so we can continue to bring amazing and inspiring African folktale stories to you.